I'm 33 years old. And before I get into what actually happened, I need to explain a bit about myself. Because without that, none of this really makes sense. I grew up in a very large family. I was one of 11 siblings. And while people usually react to that with a smile or some kind of romantic idea of a big, happy household, the reality was a bit different. My parents did their best. They really did. But with that many kids, attention was always divided, always rushed, always incomplete. Nobody was neglected on purpose, but at the same time, nobody ever felt fully seen either. My older siblings were often forced into roles they never asked for, almost like substitute parents. And the younger ones, myself included, learned very early how to blend into the background. Money was never a problem, and that helped a lot. If it hadn't been for that, things could have gone very wrong. Still, growing up surrounded by constant noise, voices, movement, and people had an effect on me that I didn't understand until much later in life. I realized slowly that I didn't know how to be alone. At first, it didn't look like fear. It just felt normal to always need something happening around me. In college, for example, I could never study in silence. I always had music on, or I'd go to crowded cafes, places where I could hear people talking, cups clinking. When I spent too much time alone at home, I'd get restless and anxious without really knowing why. And looking back now, I can see that I would often jump into friendships or relationships that weren't good for me, simply because being alone felt worse. I didn't plan any of that. It wasn't conscious. It was just how I moved through the world. Last year, one of my closest friends said something that stuck with me. She told me, very plainly, that I needed to spend more time alone. That I needed to learn how to hear myself and stop just absorbing the opinions of whoever was closest at the time. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it stayed with me, and it pushed me to start doing something different. So I started making small promises to myself. Sitting alone, staying in silence, not distracting myself right away. At first, it felt wrong, almost uncomfortable in a physical way, like I was doing something I wasn't built for. But over time, it got easier. And then it got better. I started thinking more clearly, trusting my own reactions, and actually enjoying those quiet moments. All of this is what led me to what happened. I've been hiking and climbing since I was young, but I had always done it with other people, never alone. Toward the end of last year, I decided I wanted to take that step, to really experience isolation. Not just a few hours without company, but real solitude. I found a small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, not extremely far from where I live, but far enough to feel properly remote. The original idea was to camp, but the truth is, I wasn't fully confident in my ability to handle camping in the snow. And on top of that, the idea of being completely vulnerable in the middle of the night scared me. Growing up around here means growing up with all the forest myths, and whether we like it or not, those stories seep into you to the point where you sometimes can't tell what's real anymore and what's just imagination. So I decided to play it safe, and I'm glad I did. The cabin was cheap, and the owner was very clear about why. It was tiny. It had been used for years as a hunting cabin, and only recently started being rented out. One single room, a narrow single bed, a small stove, a basic cooking area, and this sort of odd hole that was meant to serve as a bathroom, all in the same space. That was it. Still, since I was going alone, it felt perfect. When I arrived, nothing felt strange. The place was clean, simple, Exactly what I expected. There was even a kind of charm to it. Near the entrance, there was a small piece of paper with instructions. How to light the stove, how to keep the cabin safe, things like that. But one detail stood out. Behind the bed, low on the wall, right near where your head would be when you slept, there was a small hole sealed with something like a wooden plug. The note mentioned it briefly, saying that if you removed it, you could look outside. I didn't really understand why it was there. The cabin had a window and a door, so it wasn't like there was no other way to see outside. Still, I unscrewed the plug and looked through. All I could see were trees and a small patch of forest. Nothing unusual. I put it back, but I remember feeling slightly uncomfortable, especially because of how close it was to the bed. I told myself it probably had something to do with hunting. Since I know nothing about that world, I let it go. The rest of the day went fine. I unpacked, lit the stove because it was freezing, and prepared for the hike I had planned for the next day. That night, though, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin. It wasn't loud, and it didn't last long. Just enough to make me pause and listen. The cabin was so small that it barely felt sturdier than a tent. And I remember thinking how little protection it would offer if someone really wanted to get inside. Still, the sound stopped, and I couldn't be sure if it had been real or just my mind reacting to the isolation. So eventually I brushed it off and went to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I hadn't woken up during the night, which isn't unusual for me, and I got ready for my hike. There was a lot of snow, which made it more challenging, but nothing I couldn't handle. As I walked, though, that uneasy feeling came back. A sense that I wasn't completely alone, even though I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps from the night before felt less imaginary with every step. And what bothered me the most was that I started doubting myself, doubting what I was feeling. And that kind of uncertainty is terrifying when you're out there by yourself. About halfway through the hike, I decided to turn back. The trail looped, and the map showed a shortcut that cut across unmarked terrain. It wasn't ideal, but it looked doable. That's when I saw the footprints. The snow had stopped falling more than an hour earlier, and the ground was mostly undisturbed, except for a set of large boot prints. Fresh ones. Men's boots. I know that logically, this isn't shocking. People hike. People pass through forests. But when you believe you're alone, and then you realize you might not be, fear creeps in whether you want it to or not. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't wait around either. I turned back toward the cabin as quickly as I could. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination run ahead of me. But I also knew I didn't want to be reckless. I made it back to the cabin without crossing paths with anyone, and decided to stay in for the rest of the day and reassess in the morning. But that night, I heard the footsteps again, and this time, there was no doubt that someone was outside. By then, it felt like too much to ignore. The feeling during the hike, the footprints, the sounds. I thought about calling out, asking who was there, maybe even pretending I was armed. But something stopped me. I didn't open the shutters. The idea of looking out into the darkness and seeing someone staring back made my stomach turn. That's when I remembered the hole. As quietly as I could, I moved toward the bed and unscrewed the plug. It wasn't something I had really thought through or planned. It was more of an impulse, Like in that moment, that small hole suddenly made sense. And I can't fully explain why. I just know that when I looked through it, on the other side, there was the most terrifying thing I could have imagined. There was an eye, wide open, staring straight back at me. Someone was already there, their face pressed close, watching the inside of the cabin. I stumbled backward and fell, nearly burning myself on the stove. And I couldn't pull my eyes away from that hole, or from that eye. The way it blinked but never once broke its focus on me. I rushed forward, shoved the plug back into place, and pressed a pillow against the wall. I grabbed my satellite phone and called for help immediately, explaining that someone was outside and that I felt genuinely threatened. I expected hesitation, but I didn't get any. They told me to stay where I was and said a patrol was on the way. Less than an hour later, they arrived, and I left the cabin that same night. A report was filed, and I told the owner everything. Even though they found footprints in the snow and spots along the cabin walls where the snow was gone, as if someone had walked around it with their fingers pressed against the wood, nothing else was ever found. And whatever had been watching me through that hole was already gone. They only searched for a few hours before giving up. After all, there hadn't been any direct threat, and it could have just been some strange person. Someone who likes to watch others, but isn't necessarily violent. But there's one detail that still bothers me. From the outside, that hole was invisible. You wouldn't notice it unless you already knew it was there, unless you had been inside that cabin before, or unless someone had told you exactly where to look. On top of that, ever since then, I've been trying to find any explanation for what that tiny hole could have been. Barely bigger than an eye. I can't find any useful information online, so I assume it's not something common. If I hadn't read that note on the cabin door, I probably wouldn't have even noticed it. The owner himself doesn't know what the hole was for. If anyone has any idea why it was there, or any theories, please tell me. It's been eating at me because I keep thinking the person would have had to know that hole existed. This wasn't that long ago, and it's still fresh in my mind. I know it might not sound terrifying to everyone, but for me, it was enough. I don't think I'll ever put myself in that level of isolation again. What I'm about to tell you feels completely surreal, and even now I struggle to understand the purpose behind it. All I know is that it was genuinely terrifying, and every instinct I have tells me I barely escaped something dark. But tell me what you think. I've spent most of my life in the Blue Ridge Mountains, so camping was never something exotic or romantic to me. It was just something you did, something you grew up around. Especially if you lived in a place where the forest always felt closer than other people. Still, that winter I had been searching for a good spot for days. No matter how much I drove or walked, nothing felt quite right. The snow had made most of my usual places inaccessible. Eventually, I settled for a place that wasn't ideal, but felt reasonable at the time. It was close to an old road. Not right on it, but close enough that I knew I could reach it if something went wrong. That road used to matter years ago, before they built a newer access on the other side of the mountain, and now almost no one used it anymore. I knew that because I was from the area, and because I had driven that stretch countless times without seeing another car. So even though it wasn't completely isolated, it felt empty enough to take the risk. Since I wanted to do the hike on foot and not depend on the car, I left early in the morning, well before the sun had fully risen, and I walked for hours through the cold and the snow. By the time I reached the spot I had seen and chosen a few weeks earlier, it was still early, but I was already feeling the weight of the journey. And yet, despite the distance and the effort, I arrived there in less than 4 hours, exactly where I'd planned to be. I didn't set up the tent right away. Instead, I left my gear there and took a walk around the area first, just to get a better feel for the place and to let myself become more comfortable with the surroundings. I set up my tent just before nightfall, with the snow falling steadily and the forest growing quieter by the minute. Everything felt normal, uneventful, and honestly, a little disappointing, which is usually how the safest nights begin. Don't get me wrong when I say it was disappointing. I'm not saying that because I wanted trouble. It's just that part of the reason I do these retreats is to see wildlife, and that's my favorite part. It was disappointing because there wasn't much animal activity in that area. I ate, checked my gear, and eventually fell asleep to the sound of wind brushing through the trees and nothing else. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up, only that when I did, the light was blinding. For a moment, I couldn't understand where I was or why it felt like daytime inside my tent. Then I realized the light wasn't natural. It was coming from headlights, intense and unmoving, shining directly through the fabric. That's when it hit me just how close I must have been to the road, closer than I remembered, and close enough for a car to be lighting up my tent like a spotlight. I stayed completely still, my heart racing, trying to listen for anything that would explain what was happening. I expected footsteps, voices, doors slamming, anything at all. Instead, there was nothing. Just the hum of an engine somewhere beyond the trees and the light pressing in from all sides. I lay there for what felt like a long time, frozen, weighing my options and realizing that none of them felt right. Eventually, when nothing changed and the silence continued, I decided I couldn't just stay there. Slowly and carefully, I reached for my emergency pack and the protective gear I kept close, and then I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the snow. Moving through the trees, I tried to stay low and quiet, circling just enough to get a clearer view of the road. That's when I saw the car, and immediately knew something was wrong. It wasn't parked along the side like you'd expect. It was stopped perpendicular to the road, blocking both lanes. All the doors were open, front and back, and the headlights were still on, aimed directly toward the trees and, unknowingly, toward me. I couldn't see anyone inside the car. Everything about it felt deliberate and careless at the same time. And I couldn't make sense of why someone would stop like that at 3 in the morning, in the middle of nowhere, with no sign of urgency or distress. That's when the thought settled in, cold and heavy, that whoever had been in that car was no longer in it. And that meant they were somewhere in the forest instead. Somewhere near me. Somewhere I couldn't see. I started backing away, slowly at first, keeping the trees between myself and the road. Every sense stretched thin. The farther I moved, the more exposed I felt, knowing that I had no idea where the other person was or what they were doing. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw him. He stood near the car, holding an axe loosely at his side, turning his head as if he was scanning the woods. Not rushed and not frantic, just looking. The way he moved didn't suggest panic or confusion, and that somehow made it worse. He hadn't seen me yet, and I knew that the moment he did, whatever control I still had over the situation would be gone. I didn't look back again. I turned and ran, keeping my steps as quiet as I could, pushing through snow and branches, focusing only on putting distance between myself and that road. I ran until my lungs burned, and then kept running, afraid to stop. Afraid that if I did, I'd hear footsteps behind me or see the forest light up again. I've heard countless stories like this, about being chased through the woods, and I always thought it wouldn't be as terrifying as people made it out to be. But believe me when I tell you that it is. Running without direction, between the trees, not knowing whether the person is actually behind you or not, is terrifying. Every normal sound in the forest suddenly feels like a potential threat, and it puts you on such a high alert that it starts to destroy you. If you're not careful, it can become a paralyzing feeling, or something that completely strips you of the ability to think clearly. By the time dawn came, I was exhausted but far from where I had started. I followed familiar terrain toward my town, relying more on instinct than direction. And when I finally reached a place I recognized, I felt something close to relief for the first time. I never went back for my tent. I never returned to that spot on foot. I've driven along that road a few times since then, and every time I pass by, I feel a slight chill run through me. More than once, I've had the urge to go back and see if my tent is still there and what condition it's in. But I've always resisted the impulse to pull over and stop the car. To this day, I don't know what that man was looking for, or why he was there with an axe in the middle of the night. I don't know if it had anything to do with me, and part of me believes it probably didn't, since I had told no one where I was going and made a habit of changing locations every time. Still, the timing was too strange to ignore, and I can't shake the feeling that I walked away from something that could have ended very differently. Maybe I was never meant to find out what his intention was. Maybe realizing how close I came is the only answer I'll ever get.